Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, fans. So this is Battlefield 1. In today's weapon review, we're going to be taking a close look at the Ribeyrolles 1918, available of course since the French DLC They Shall Not Pass for the assault class in Battlefield 1. As per usual for these weapon reviews, we're going to be looking at the stats of this weapon, how it performs both compared to itself in the different variants available, as well as other weaponry available to the assault class in Battlefield 1, and last but certainly not least, how to get the most out of this weapon when using it on the battlefield. Starting off then as we usually do, with the stats of the basic variant of this weapon, the 1918 Factory. Now it comes in with a maximum damage, of course, since TTK 2.0 of 28, a minimum damage of 17.5, netting you of course a 4-shot kill all the way out to 12 meters, and from 29 meters onwards a 6-shot kill. Fire rate is on the lower end of things at 550 rounds per minute. Muzzle velocity for the SMG category of weaponry, of course, which this belongs to, on the upper end of what is possible at 520 meters per second. The magazine size, of course, being on the slightly smaller end at 25. However, the reload times on the slightly better end of things at 2.1 seconds for the short reload and 2.766 seconds for the long reload. That's, of course, with no bullets left in your chamber. Recoil is not what it used to be. That is to say that recoil is been slightly increased since this weapon initially was first introduced. You've got vertical recoil here of 0.504, but more importantly horizontal recoil, which isn't too high at 0.33 to the left and right, good recoil decrease at 16, and a first shot recoil multiplier at 1.083, which is of course very low, meaning that this weapon essentially has no first shot kick. The spread attributes of this weapon are mostly in what you would expect for this kind of SMG, but not necessarily the standard values attributed to SMGs, with a basic ADS, that's while aiming down sight and not moving, of 0.24, an ADS while moving at 0.76, and decent but not excellent hipfire while standing and moving simultaneously at 2.25. Spread increase per shot is the usual 0.045. However, the first shot spread multiplier, and as a consequence, this weapon's spread when actually being fired consecutively or in full automatic mode is significantly lower, both for ADS and hipfire at 3. Meaning this weapon is, from a spread statistical perspective, significantly more accurate than comparative SMGs out there. Now, where this weapon gets, of course, very much interesting is with the introduction of the optical variant of it. Now, there is only a few differences between these two weapons, and they are typically down lines of between a factory and optical comparison, but the most notable feature is of course the difference in iron sights versus optical sights. Now, the problem of course with optical sights in Battlefield 1 is not only the amount of reticle bounce or screen shake associated with the reticle, which is of course much more difficult to deal with in a housed sight such as the optical one, where there's more obstruction on your target already to begin with, and to make things, well, comparatively at least worse, the Ribeyrolles factory actually has one of the best, if not the best, SMG iron sight available in Battlefield 1. It's very clear, it leaves you with very little of your actual screen obstructed and makes it much easier than comparative other iron sights, for example the Automaticos, to actually keep your crosshair on target. Besides those relative obvious differences, the statistical differences between these weapons are a better recoil decrease for the factory variant versus the optical with 16 versus 8, a slightly better first shot recoil multiplier for the factory at 1.083 versus the 1.3 on the optical. And for the optical, on the other hand, better accuracy, that is to say a base ADS of 0.18 instead of the 0.24 of the factory variant, a ADS while moving at 0.57, pretty damn accurate compared to the 0.76 of the factory variant, and better first shot spread multiplier, even better on the optical compared to the factory at 2 instead of 3, meaning that the optical is one of the most accurate, if not the most accurate, SMG available to the assault class from a spread perspective, simply because of that extremely low first shot spread multiplier. The last difference to note is the spread decrease. That is, of course, better on the factory variant compared to the optical with 4.05 degrees per second versus the 2.7 found on the optical. Where this leaves you is in an interesting position. These two weapons are amongst actually my favorite SMGs to use in Battlefield 1 because, as noted in my initial weapon review now over a year ago, the Ribeyrolles really is a versatile SMG, at least in terms of Battlefield 1 assault weapon. It does not compare to an autoloading 835 or many of the medic SLRs in terms of its ideal engagement distance and how far it can stretch that. But for the assault class of weaponry, which is usually very, very limited to a set engagement distance, extreme close quarters for the majority of the weapons, it is a breath of fresh air to use a Ribeyrolles over something like an Automatico, a Hellriegel, an SMG 0818, an even more extreme version like a Machine Pistola, or even the MP18, which is its main competitor for most engagements. It allows you as Assault to be less restricted to the close quarter only combat, but doesn't leave you hopeless in close quarter. And I think today's footage is probably an excellent illustration of just how good you can be in close quarters with this weapon if you're engaging in proactive playstyle. If you're engaging targets, you're not being surprised by 3 players running around the corner with a shotgun. Its hipfire is not as good as trench variants out there, but good enough for situations where I personally end up using hipfire to reliably be able to do so. I don't find myself at a disadvantage using this over the MP18 Trench in close quarter situations hip-firing, because in the situations where the MP18 Trench, for example, would be the more accurate hip-firing weapon, I tend not to actually hip-fire. I tend to take the time to ADS. Now that is very much a personal playstyle thing, but ultimately is something to take into account. Hip-fire on this weapon is good enough, and its ADS performance is better than most SMGs out there. Now, whether between the optical and factory variant of this weapon, which is the best, things are difficult, because of course both things are nice. The slightly lower recoil in form of first shot recoil multiplier and better recoil decrease and spread decrease are nice features, and frankly I almost prefer the iron sights variant of the Ribeyrolles over the optical variant. However, the optical variant is objectively slightly more accurate. It has the better ADS numbers, especially it has a better first shot spread multiplier. This weapon is usually ADS'd, and given that increasingly when I'm using the Ribeyrolles, I find opportunities to try and make use of its unique feature, a bipod, to get even more accuracy out of it, I find that, well, there isn't so much reticle bounce that I'm having to deal with that it's inhibiting me, and I can fully take advantage of its accuracy. Even when not using the bipod, the better accuracy shines through and is definitely an advantage. Ultimately, I don't think I'm going to be able to make a decision between these two weapons anytime soon. I'm more familiar, more comfortable with the factory variant because that version of the weapon has been out for longer and I've had the pleasure of using it for a longer amount of time, but the optical is definitely a good contender, given of course that it is only slightly different from the usual factory variant. Having talked about how they compare to each other and even how they compare to other SMGs, when it comes down to using these weapons effectively, things are relatively simple. This is a flexible weapon. You usually will not have an advantage in terms of weaponry over an opponent who is dealing with you with his weapon at his ideal engagement distance. In close encounter combat, you're at a disadvantage against the majority of SMG players, the majority of assault players in general, especially if they're using shotguns. At medium long range, you're probably at a disadvantage against somebody using an SLR who is capable and proficient with that SLR. Somebody using an autoloading, somebody using a Che Rigotti, a Mondragon. They've probably got the leg up on you if they're more in the medium to medium long range. Actually though, in the close medium range, you may even have an advantage. But generally with this weapon, you just have to play carefully. You have to take into account that you have a slight disadvantage, possibly against an enemy in their ideal engagement distance, but the distance at which you can proficiently attack the enemy is significantly larger. Thus there's less emphasis with this weapon on positioning yourself at an ideal situation and more emphasis on good movement and not biting off too much at one time. Not actually engaging 3 targets at once and sticking to a one-on-one situation. Flanking is very important with this weapon as well. And lastly, if you can take advantage of that bipod, do so, because it will absolutely massively decrease your time to kill on target compared to using this weapon without a bipod, at least in non-close encounter combat situations. And that wraps it up pretty much for the Ribeyrolles. I'd love to know your opinions on this weapon review, as well as your usual video suggestions. So leave those down below in the comments or hit me up with them on Twitter. If you enjoyed this video, found it helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. But with all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 1 video.